The December morning light filtered through Laura Martinez's apartment windows, casting long shadows across her cluttered desk. Empty coffee mugs formed a semicircle around her laptop, evidence of another sleepless night spent perfecting GreenNest's latest sustainability report. At 34, Laura had grown accustomed to these marathon work sessions, but today felt different. Christmas Eve should have brought excitement, yet anxiety gnawed at her stomach as she stared at her phone. "Maya, I need those final shipping confirmations by noon," she said into her headset, scrolling through emails that seemed to multiply faster than she could respond to them. Her assistant's voice crackled through with characteristic enthusiasm. "Already on it, boss!" And Laura, Maya's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "That big investor I mentioned? They called again this morning. Said they'll have news after the holidays." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Laura's heart skipped, but she forced herself to remain cautious. In 3 years of building GreenNest from nothing more than a sketched idea on a napkin, she'd learned that potential deals had a way of evaporating like morning mist. Don't get too excited yet. We've been down this road before. "But this feels different," Maya insisted. "The questions they're asking, the due diligence requests, it's serious money this time." Laura allowed herself a moment of hope before reality crashed back. Even if the deal materialized, would it matter to her family? Would it finally prove that her boutique hobby, as Daniel liked to call it, was worth something? She closed her laptop and walked to her bedroom, where a simple black dress hung on the closet door, her armor for tonight's family dinner. The dress had cost her $30 at a thrift store, carefully selected to avoid the kind of scrutiny that came with wearing something too expensive or too cheap around the Martinez family table. Everything was a calculation with them, every choice dissected for evidence of success or failure. From her dresser drawer, she pulled out a small wrapped package, her gift for the family. Inside was a beautifully crafted photo album she'd made herself, filled with pictures spanning 3 generations of Martinez family gatherings. She'd spent weeks collecting photos from relatives, scanning old prints, and arranging them chronologically. It was the kind of thoughtful, time-intensive gift that would probably be politely acknowledged and quickly forgotten, especially next to whatever expensive offerings Daniel would arrive with. Laura caught her reflection in the bedroom mirror. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her usually vibrant smile looked forced. When had she started looking so tired? When had family gatherings become something to endure rather than enjoy? The apartment felt too quiet suddenly. She moved to the kitchen and began washing the coffee mugs, a mindless task that usually calmed her nerves. But today, even the familiar rhythm of soap and water couldn't quiet the voice in her head that whispered all the things Daniel might say tonight. She could almost hear his condescending chuckle, see the way he'd dismiss her work with a wave of his manicured hand. "You're being ridiculous," she told herself aloud. But the words felt hollow. 3 years of building something meaningful from nothing, 3 years of sacrifice and 18-hour days, 3 years of believing in a vision that most people couldn't see, and still she craved her family's approval like a child seeking validation. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sophia. "Mija, can't wait to see you tonight. Wear something warm, it's supposed to snow." The tenderness in her mother's message made Laura's throat tight. Sophia Martinez had always been the family's emotional center, the one who smoothed over conflicts and ensured everyone felt loved. But even her mother's warmth couldn't completely shield Laura from the subtle disappointment that seemed to follow her life choices. Sophia supported her in quiet ways, asking about the business, praising Laura's dedication, but never quite defended her when Daniel's criticisms grew sharp. Laura finished the dishes and returned to her desk, staring at the GreenNest logo on her laptop screen. The simple design, a bird's nest cradling a green leaf, represented everything she'd poured her heart into. Sustainable packaging solutions for small businesses, biodegradable alternatives to plastic waste, innovative designs that proved environmental responsibility didn't have to mean compromising quality or affordability. It was work that mattered, work that made a difference, even if her family couldn't see it. She thought about the early days, when GreenNest existed only in her imagination and a shared workspace in a converted warehouse. The night she'd fallen asleep at her desk, the morning she'd woken with cardboard prototypes pressed against her cheek. The first client who'd taken a chance on her untested products. The first positive review that had made her cry with relief. Every milestone had been celebrated alone or with Maya and the small team she'd slowly assembled. Her family had been noticeably absent from these victories, offering perfunctory congratulations when pressed, but never genuine enthusiasm. She'd stopped sharing the exciting developments months ago, tired of watching their eyes glaze over when she tried to explain why a new client or a positive review mattered. Laura glanced at the clock, 3:47 p.m. In a few hours, she'd be sitting around her parents' dining room table, surrounded by the people who should have been her biggest supporters. Instead, she'd brace herself for subtle jabs about her unmarried status, her cramped apartment, her unconventional career path. She'd smile and nod and pretend their words didn't cut straight through her carefully constructed confidence.
But tonight, she decided, would be different. Tonight, she wouldn't apologize for her choices or defend her dreams. She'd hold her head high and remember that success wasn't measured solely in bank account balances or prestigious job titles. She'd built something beautiful and meaningful, and that had to count for something. Laura picked up her phone and scrolled to Maya's contact information. On impulse, she typed, "Thank you for believing in this crazy dream." The response came back immediately, "Thank you for making it real. See you after the holidays, boss. Knock 'em dead tonight." Laura smiled. Her first genuine smile of the day. Whatever happened at dinner, whatever cutting remarks Daniel might make, she knew that somewhere in the city there was a team of people who respected her work and believed in her vision. That knowledge would have to be armor enough. Snow had indeed begun to fall by the time Laura's Uber pulled up to her parents' house in Lincoln Park. The Victorian home glowed with warm light, wreaths hanging from every window, garlands draping the porch railings. Despite her apprehension, Laura felt a familiar tug of nostalgia. This house had been her childhood sanctuary, filled with the aromas of Sophia's cooking and the sound of her father's classical music drifting from his study. The front door opened before she could knock, and Sophia Martinez burst onto the porch, arms outstretched. At 58, Laura's mother retained the striking beauty that had first caught Richard's attention 36 years ago, her silver-streaked hair pulled into an elegant chignon, her Christmas sweater somehow managing to look chic rather than festive. "Mija!" Sophia enveloped Laura in a cloud of familiar perfume and warmth. "You look too thin. Are you eating enough? Come inside before you catch cold." Laura allowed herself to be pulled into the house, where the familiar sounds of family gathering washed over her. Laughter echoed from the living room, accompanied by the clink of wine glasses and the low murmur of adult conversation. The house smelled like her childhood. Pine from the Christmas tree, cinnamon from Sophia's traditional holiday cookies, and the rich aroma of the feast that would soon fill the dining room table. "Let me take your coat," she fussed, already reaching for the buttons before Laura could protest. "Did you drive? In this weather, you should have let Daniel pick you up. He has that new BMW with all the safety features." "I took an Uber, Mama. It's fine." Laura kept her voice light, though she caught the implication that Daniel's success afforded him luxuries like reliable transportation, while Laura's choices left her dependent on rideshares and public transit. They moved into the living room where the Christmas tree dominated one corner, its lights twinkling against carefully arranged ornaments collected over decades of family celebrations. Richard Martinez sat in his leather armchair, glasses perched on his nose, as he studied what appeared to be architectural plans, old habits dying hard even in retirement. He looked up as they entered, offering a warm but reserved smile. "Laura, good to see you." Richard's voice carried the same measured tone he'd used throughout her childhood, kind but somehow distant, as if he were perpetually evaluating her from behind an invisible professional barrier. "How's the business?" Before Laura could answer, Daniel's voice cut across the room like a blade wrapped in silk. "Ah, the entrepreneur arrives.
Still saving the world one cardboard box at a time? Laura turned to face her older brother, and as always, felt a complex mix of love and resentment wash over her. At 37, Daniel had inherited their parents' tall frame and their mother's dark eyes, along with an innate confidence that seemed to radiate from his very pores. Tonight he wore a charcoal cashmere sweater that probably cost more than Laura's monthly rent, his hair perfectly styled, his smile sharp enough to cut glass. "Hello, Daniel." Laura forced warmth into her voice. "Still making money off other people's dreams?" "Guilty as charged. Though I prefer to think of it as helping serious businesses reach their potential. Speaking of which," he gestured toward the bar cart with his wine glass, "care to tell us about this big investor Maya mentioned? Or was that another one of those almost deals you're so fond of collecting?" Laura's blood chilled. Maya had mentioned the investor call to her this morning, but how did Daniel know about it? The realization hit her like a punch to the stomach. Her assistant's enthusiasm had led her to share the news with other people, probably assuming it would be welcome information to spread. In Daniel's world, that kind of premature celebration was seen as amateur hour. "It's preliminary," she said carefully, aware that every family member was now listening. "Nothing concrete yet." "Ah," he nodded with mock understanding. "So another potential opportunity that will mysteriously evaporate after the holidays. How many does that make this year? 3? 4? Aunt Clara, Sophia's sharp-tongued sister, looked up from her position near the fireplace where she had been holding court with Marcus Taylor, a longtime family friend. At 62, Clara never married, dedicating herself instead to a career in real estate that had made her wealthy enough to speak her mind without consequence. "Well, at least she's trying something," Clara said, though her tone suggested this was hardly praise. "Though I do worry about all these experimental careers young people pursue these days. In my generation, we understood the value of stability." Laura felt heat rise in her cheeks, but before she could respond, Marcus cleared his throat. A soft-spoken man in his 50s who had been Richard's business partner before retirement, Marcus had always shown kindness to Laura, though he rarely spoke up during family conflicts. "Actually," Marcus said quietly, "sustainable packaging is becoming increasingly important to major corporations. Consumer demand for environmental responsibility is driving significant changes in procurement decisions." Daniel waved dismissively. "Sure, it's a nice talking point for corporate PR departments. But when it comes to actual purchasing decisions, cost and efficiency always win out over feel-good initiatives." "That's not necessarily true," Laura began, but Daniel was already moving on. "Besides, Laura's operating in the boutique space. Small businesses, artisanal clients, farmers market vendors. It's charming, but hardly scalable. Real business happens when you can move volume and impact bottom lines across entire industries." The casual dismissal stung more than an outright insult would have. Daniel had managed to reduce 3 years of her life's work to a quaint hobby in a single sentence, and he'd done it with the confident smile of someone who genuinely believed he was being generous in his assessment. Richard folded his architectural plans and looked between his children with the expression of someone trying to navigate a minefield. "Both of you have found your paths. That's what matters." But his words felt hollow, a diplomatic non-statement that avoided taking sides while somehow managing to validate neither of them. Laura caught the subtle implication that her path was equivalent to Daniel's success, a false equivalency that diminished everything she had accomplished. Sophia bustled toward the dining room, calling over her shoulder, "Dinner is ready! Come, everyone! Clara, help me with the wine!" As the family began to migrate toward the dining room, Laura lingered for a moment, watching Daniel straighten his sweater and check his reflection in the hallway mirror. Everything about him radiated the confidence of someone who never questioned his place in the world, never doubted that his choices would be celebrated and supported.
She envied that certainty, even as she resented the ease with which he wielded it against her. The Martinez family dining room had always been the stage for their most memorable moments, both joyful and painful. Tonight, the mahogany table gleamed under the soft light of the chandelier, set with Sophia's best china and the silver flatware that had been her wedding gift from Richard's mother. Platters of traditional Christmas Eve dishes crowded the surface. Bacalao, tamales, pozole, and arroz con gandules. Each recipe perfected over decades of family gatherings. Laura found herself seated directly across from Daniel, a positioning that felt like a strategic move orchestrated by fate itself. Sophia bustled between the kitchen and dining room, ensuring everyone's plate was full, while Richard assumed his traditional role at the head of the table, carving the roasted pork with the precision of a man who approached every task as if it were an architectural blueprint. "Clara, pass the wine to Daniel," Sophia instructed, settling into her own chair with a satisfied sigh. "Now, let's go around the table and share our blessings from this year. Laura, why don't you start?" Laura's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Being put on the spot like this was exactly what she'd hoped to avoid. "Well, GreenNest has grown significantly this year. We've expanded our client base and—" "How significantly?" Daniel interrupted, reaching for his wine glass with casual confidence. "In terms of actual revenue numbers." "Daniel," Sophia chided gently, but her son was already warming to his subject. "I'm just curious about the metrics, Mama. In finance, we measure growth in concrete terms. Percentage increases, market share expansion, profit margins. These things matter when you're evaluating the viability of a business venture." Richard nodded thoughtfully. "That's sound thinking. Numbers don't lie." Laura felt the familiar sensation of being examined under a microscope, her achievements weighed and found wanting before she had even had the chance to articulate them. "We've increased our client base by 40% and expanded into 3 new market segments." "But what's the baseline?" Daniel leaned forward, his expression one of earnest professional interest that somehow managed to feel condescending. Aunt Clara laughed, like ice cubes clinking in a glass. "Listen to you two talking business at Christmas dinner. In my day, family meals were for family conversation."
Business is family conversation when you're passionate about your work, Marcus said quietly, but his words were lost in the shuffle as Daniel launched into his own update. "Speaking of passion for work," Daniel said, settling back in his chair with the air of someone about to deliver a performance, "I closed the Hartwell merger last week. 18 months of negotiations, but we finally got them to accept our terms. $700 million deal." Sophia clapped her hands together. $700 million! Daniel, that's wonderful! "The key," Daniel continued, clearly enjoying the attention, "was understanding what they really needed versus what they said they wanted. They came to us talking about market expansion and diversification, but what they actually needed was capital restructuring and debt consolidation. Once we identified the real problem, the solution became obvious." Richard leaned forward with genuine interest. "How did you identify the disconnect between their stated goals and their actual needs?" As Daniel launched into a detailed explanation of financial analysis and market research, Laura watched her family's faces. Sophia beamed with maternal pride, hanging on every word. Richard asked follow-up questions with the engaged enthusiasm he'd once brought to discussing architectural projects. Even Clara nodded approvingly, making little murmurs of admiration at particularly impressive details. This was Daniel's element, the spotlight of family attention, the validation that came from work everyone could understand and immediately recognize as important. Banking was serious business, the kind of career that parents bragged about to their friends, that commanded respect at dinner parties and family gatherings.
The beautiful thing about this particular deal, Daniel said, gesturing with his wine glass, is that it positions Hartwell for major expansion into the Pacific market. We're talking about potentially tripling their revenue within 5 years. That's the kind of transformation that changes lives, not just for the company leadership, but for thousands of employees who will benefit from the growth. Laura tried to interject her own perspective. That's similar to what we're trying to do with sustainable packaging. Small changes in procurement decisions can have enormous environmental impact when multiplied across. See, that's where you lose me, Daniel interrupted with a patronizing smile. Environmental impact is a nice theoretical concept, but at the end of the day, businesses need measurable results. They need to see how your products improve their bottom line, not just their carbon footprint. But that's exactly what GreenNest does, Laura began. In theory, Daniel continued smoothly, but in practice, you're asking companies to pay premium prices for packaging that serves the same function as cheaper alternatives, all for the sake of feeling better about their environmental choices. That's not sustainable business strategy, that's marketing to guilty consciences. Clara laughed out loud, the sound sharp and dismissive. Oh, Daniel, you do have a way of cutting straight to the heart of things. Laura felt her cheeks burn, but she kept her voice steady. It's not just about guilt. Companies are recognizing that consumers actively seek out environmentally responsible brands. Sustainability is becoming a competitive advantage. For boutique brands, maybe, Daniel conceded, with the air of someone throwing a bone to a child. But when you're talking about real business, the kind that moves markets and employs thousands of people, cost efficiency always trumps feel-good initiatives. The dismissal was so casual, so absolute, that Laura felt something inside her chest constrict. This wasn't just disagreement about business strategy. This was fundamental dismissal of her life's work, delivered with the confident smile of someone who genuinely believed he was being generous in his assessment. Laura's work is important too, Sophia said softly, but the words felt obligatory, lacking the genuine enthusiasm she'd shown for Daniel's achievements. Of course it is, Daniel agreed readily. It's admirable, really. Laura's following her passion, doing work that aligns with her values. That takes courage. He paused, swirling his wine contemplatively. I just worry sometimes that passion without pragmatism can lead to years of struggle without real progress. Richard nodded slowly. There's wisdom in that. I've seen too many talented people chase dreams that weren't economically viable. Exactly, Daniel said, warming to his theme. And Laura is brilliant. She could succeed in any number of more traditional business environments. I keep thinking she's just one good opportunity away from realizing her potential in a more substantial way. The word substantial hung in the air like smoke. Laura stared down at her plate, her appetite completely gone. In a few carefully chosen sentences, Daniel had managed to reduce her entire professional identity to a phase she was going through, a detour on the path to something more serious and adult. Well, Aunt Clara said brightly, raising her glass, here's to Daniel's success, and to Laura's interesting journey.
The toast felt like a funeral, celebrating Daniel's achievements while eulogizing Laura's dreams. As glasses clinked around the table, Laura forced herself to smile and lift her own wine, but inside, something was breaking apart. She had come here hoping for support, perhaps even recognition. Instead, she had been handed a masterclass in how family love could feel like slow suffocation, how concern could be weaponized, how dismissal could be dressed up as wisdom. Marcus caught her eye across the table and offered a small, sympathetic smile, but even his kindness felt insufficient against the weight of her family's collective judgment. Daniel was already moving on to another story, another triumph, another demonstration of his substantial place in the substantial world. Laura sat in her chair and smiled and nodded at appropriate moments. But inside, she was already walking out into the snow, already counting the hours until she could return to her small apartment and her boutique dreams and the people who understood why her work mattered. The evening stretched ahead of her like a series of small humiliations, each one carefully wrapped in love. The conversation had lulled into that comfortable post-meal rhythm where wine-warmed voices mixed with the soft clink of dessert spoons against china. Sophia had just served her famous flan, the caramel sauce gleaming under the chandelier light, when Daniel leaned back in his chair with the satisfied air of someone who had enjoyed both the meal and his role as the evening's primary entertainer. "You know," he said, swirling the last drops of wine in his glass, "I was thinking about what Marcus said earlier about sustainable packaging becoming important to major corporations." His tone was conversational, almost friendly, which should have been Laura's first warning. And I realized something interesting about the fundamental difference between what Laura does and what I do. Laura felt her stomach tighten, but she kept her expression neutral, her spoon moving mechanically through the flan she could no longer taste. "The difference," Daniel continued, his voice gaining that lecturing quality that had always preceded his most devastating observations, "is that when I work with a company, I'm dealing with real problems that affect real people's livelihoods. Market fluctuations, capital structures, regulatory compliance. These are serious issues with serious consequences." Richard nodded thoughtfully, his attention fully focused on his son. "That's the responsibility that comes with handling other people's financial security." "Exactly, Dad. When Hartwell came to us, they had 7,000 employees whose jobs depended on us finding the right solution. 7,000 families counting on us to get it right." He paused for effect, letting the weight of that number settle over the table. "That's the kind of pressure that separates real business from boutique hobbies." The phrase hung in the air like a blade suspended over Laura's head. She could feel it coming now. The moment when Daniel would deliver his verdict with surgical precision, cutting away everything she had built with the casual efficiency of someone performing a routine amputation. "Now, I'm not diminishing what Laura does," Daniel said, and the disclaimer somehow made what followed worse. "Eco-friendly packaging serves a purpose. It makes people feel good about their purchasing decisions. It's a nice value add for companies that want to signal their environmental consciousness to consumers who care about that sort of thing." Aunt Clara laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Oh, Daniel, you're being generous. Most of these environmental initiatives are just expensive ways for companies to pat themselves on the back." "Well, I wouldn't go that far," Daniel replied with mock diplomacy. "But let's be honest about what we're talking about here. Laura's business, and I respect her for building something from nothing, I really do, but it's essentially a boutique operation serving niche clients who can afford to pay premium prices for the luxury of feeling environmentally responsible." Laura's hands trembled slightly as she set down her spoon. She could feel the familiar heat of humiliation rising in her chest, but she forced herself to remain silent, to maintain the dignity that had become her armor in moments like these. "That's not the same thing as solving systemic problems or creating sustainable value for thousands of stakeholders," Daniel continued, his voice gaining momentum. "And I think, and please don't take this personally, Laura, but I think there's something almost selfish about prioritizing personal passion projects over contributing to the kind of serious economic work that actually matters." The silence that followed was deafening. Laura felt as though she had been slapped, not just by Daniel's words, but by the absence of any voice rising to defend her. Sophia stared down at her dessert, her face carefully neutral. Richard maintained his thoughtful expression, as if considering Daniel's argument on its merits. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but said nothing. I mean, when you really think about it, what Laura does is essentially a joke compared to real work. It's playing at business, not actually doing business.
Aunt Clara's laugh was sharp and delighted. "A joke. Oh, Daniel, that's perfect. All these young people with their little passion projects thinking they're changing the world with their organic this and sustainable that." The laughter that followed was like acid in Laura's veins. Not just Clara's harsh cackle, but the polite chuckles from around the table, Richard's low rumble of amusement, Sophia's nervous giggle, even Marcus's uncomfortable throat clearing that somehow managed to sound like agreement. Laura sat frozen, her hands gripping the edge of the table with enough force to make her knuckles white. Every instinct screamed at her to defend herself, to list her accomplishments, to explain why her work mattered, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she felt that familiar sensation of shrinking, of becoming smaller and smaller, until she might disappear entirely. "Laura?" Sophia's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Are you all right, mija? You look pale." Laura blinked, realizing that everyone was staring at her. She forced her facial muscles into something resembling a smile, though it felt more like a grimace. "I'm fine, just tired." "Of course you're tired," Daniel said with what might have been intended as sympathy. "Running a small business is exhausting, especially when you're trying to do everything yourself. Maybe it's time to consider whether all that effort is really worth it." The suggestion was delivered with such casual kindness that it took Laura a moment to recognize it as the final nail in her professional coffin. Not only was her work a joke, but Daniel was now implying that she should give up entirely for her own good. "Maybe Daniel's right," Richard said slowly, his voice carrying the weight of paternal concern. "You've given it a good try, Laura. No one can say you didn't put in the effort. But sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself is recognize when it's time to pivot to something more stable." Sophia reached across the table and patted Laura's hand, her touch gentle but somehow patronizing. "You're so smart, mija. You could do anything you set your mind to. Daniel's company is always looking for talented people." The offer of charity employment from her older brother was the final humiliation. Laura pulled her hand away from her mother's touch and stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "I should go," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "Early morning tomorrow." "On Christmas?" Sophia asked, confusion evident in her voice. "Business doesn't stop for holidays," Laura replied, and realized as she said it that the words sounded exactly like something Daniel would say, which somehow made everything worse. The goodbyes were a blur of awkward hugs and hollow promises to stay in touch. Daniel clapped her on the shoulder with brotherly affection, as if he hadn't just spent the evening systematically destroying her sense of self-worth. "Think about what I said, Laura. There's no shame in recognizing when it's time for a change." Laura nodded and smiled and made all the appropriate responses, but inside she felt hollowed out, emptied of everything except a terrible clarity about her place in her family's hierarchy. She was the dreamer, the one who chased impossible visions while the serious adults did serious work. She was a cautionary tale wrapped in Christmas dinner conversation. The Chicago wind hit Laura like a physical blow as she stepped out of her parents' house, but she welcomed its sharp bite against her flushed cheeks. Snow fell steadily now, coating the sidewalks in a pristine white blanket that muffled the city's usual cacophony. She pulled her coat tighter and began walking, her footsteps leaving solitary tracks in the fresh powder. She couldn't face the thought of waiting for an Uber, couldn't bear to make small talk with the driver while her composure hung by threads. The walk to her apartment would take 40 minutes in this weather, but she needed the time and space to process what had just happened. She needed to understand how love could feel so much like suffocation. The familiar streets of her childhood looked different through the veil of falling snow. The Victorian houses that had once seemed majestic now loomed like judgmental sentinels, their warm windows offering glimpses of other family celebrations, other dinner tables where perhaps daughters weren't dismissed as amusing diversions from serious conversation. A joke compared to real work? The words echoed in my mind with each footstep, Daniel's voice clear and confident, delivering his verdict with the authority of someone who had never doubted his right to judge. And the laughter, God, the laughter. Not malicious exactly, but worse somehow, dismissive, the kind of laughter reserved for children's games and harmless fantasies. Laura paused at a traffic light, watching the red hand blink steadily while snow accumulated on her shoulders. A couple hurried past, arm in arm, their faces bright with holiday joy, and she felt a stab of envy for their uncomplicated happiness. When had her own happiness become so fragile, so dependent on external validation? She thought about the early days of GreenNest when the idea had first taken shape during late nights at her previous job. She'd been working for a traditional packaging company then, watching truck after truck roll out loaded with materials that would end up in landfills within weeks. The waste felt obscene, personal somehow, as if she were complicit in a system she couldn't support. The first prototype had been embarrassingly crude, a cardboard container she'd assembled in her kitchen using biodegradable adhesive she'd ordered online. But it had worked. It had held together, protected its contents, and decomposed cleanly when she'd tested it in her tiny balcony garden. She'd stared at that simple box and seen possibility where others saw only cardboard. 3 years later, GreenNest had 37 active clients, from local bakeries to regional distribution companies. Their products had prevented thousands of pounds of plastic waste from entering the waste stream. They'd created jobs, sparked innovations, inspired competitors to develop their own sustainable alternatives. It was work that mattered, work that made a difference in ways that quarterly profit reports could never measure. But try explaining that to Daniel, who measured success in $700 million deals and saw environmental concern as a luxury for people who could afford to prioritize principles over profit. Try explaining it to her parents, who loved her but couldn't hide their worry about her financial stability, her unmarried status, her refusal to follow the conventional path that had served Daniel so well. Laura realized she was crying, tears mixing with melting snowflakes on her cheeks. When had she started crying? She wiped her face with the back of her glove and kept walking, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The memory hit her suddenly, vivid and painful. She was 12 years old, standing in her father's study while he examined a school project she'd spent weeks perfecting, a detailed architectural drawing of her dream house, complete with solar panels and a rainwater collection system. She'd been so proud of the way she'd incorporated environmental features while maintaining structural integrity, concepts she'd absorbed from listening to his work conversations. "Very nice, Laura," Richard had said, his tone polite but distracted, "though I think you'll find that clients are more concerned with cost efficiency than environmental features." Even then, her vision had been dismissed as impractical idealism. Even at 12, she'd been too much of a dreamer for the Martinez family's practical sensibilities. But she'd kept dreaming anyway, through high school, where her environmental science projects earned her academic recognition, but eye rolls from her family. Through college, where her business professors had encouraged her sustainable packaging concepts, while her parents worried about her unmarketable interests. Through the early years of her career, when every small success had been met with polite congratulations and gentle suggestions that she considered more stable opportunities. She'd kept believing, because the alternative was unbearable, accepting that her vision was worthless, that her work was trivial, that she was fundamentally wrong about what mattered in the world. A homeless man sat in the doorway of a closed shop, a cardboard sign propped beside him. Laura stopped and pulled a 20 from her wallet, pressing it into his gloved hands. He looked up at her with surprised gratitude, and she saw in his eyes a recognition of shared vulnerability that made her throat tight. "Bless you," he said softly, and Laura nodded, unable to speak. She walked faster now, her apartment building finally coming into view. The familiar facade looked shabby in the snow, the kind of building that Daniel would dismiss as temporary housing for people not yet ready for real success. But it was hers. She'd chosen it, earned it, filled it with work that mattered to her. The elevator wheezed as it carried her to the 7th floor, and she fumbled with her keys, suddenly desperate to be inside her own space, surrounded by her own choices. The lock turned, and she stepped into the sanctuary of her small apartment, where GreenNest prototypes covered every surface, and the walls were lined with thank you letters from clients whose businesses had been transformed by her innovations. Laura sank onto her couch and stared at the city lights twinkling through her window.
Somewhere out there, packages wrapped in her biodegradable materials were protecting precious goods while breaking down harmlessly in composting facilities. Somewhere out there, small business owners were building sustainable futures with products she designed. Somewhere out there, her work was making the kind of difference that couldn't be measured in quarterly reports. "I believe in what I built," she whispered to the emptying room, her voice barely audible above the heating system's gentle hum. "I believe in what I built." The words felt like a prayer, a declaration of faith in the face of overwhelming doubt. Tomorrow, she would wake up and continue the work that her family dismissed as a joke. She would keep building something beautiful and meaningful, even if she had to do it alone. Laura had just changed into her favorite pajamas, soft flannel pants, and an oversized GreenNest t-shirt from their first promotional order, when her phone buzzed incessantly on the coffee table. She glanced at the screen, expecting to see a text from a well-meaning friend, or perhaps a notification from one of the business apps that never seemed to sleep. Instead, Maya's name flashed urgently in the darkness of her living room. It was 11:47 p.m. on Christmas Eve. Maya should have been at home with her family, probably playing board games with her younger siblings or helping her mother prepare for tomorrow's celebration. The fact that she was calling at this hour could only mean one of two things. Either something had gone catastrophically wrong with a client shipment, or...
Laura! Maya's voice exploded through the speaker with an energy that seemed to vibrate through Laura's entire apartment. Oh my God, Laura, where are you? Are you sitting down? You need to be sitting down for this. Laura was already sitting, curled into the corner of her couch with a cup of tea growing cold in her hands. But something in Maya's tone made her set the mug aside and grip the phone tighter. I'm sitting. What's wrong? What happened? Wrong? Nothing's wrong. Everything is right. Everything is so incredibly, amazingly right that I can't even... Maya's words tumbled over each other in a breathless rush. Laura, they called. They actually called at 11:30 on Christmas Eve because apparently major corporations don't celebrate holidays when there are deals to be made. Who called? But even as Laura asked the question, her heart began to hammer against her ribs. Because she knew, somehow, despite the evening's humiliations, despite Daniel's dismissive laughter still echoing in her ears, she knew exactly who had called. Pinnacle Global Industries, Maya said, and she could hear her grinning through the phone. The biggest sustainable packaging deal in the company's history, Laura. They want to buy GreenNest. Not just a partnership, not just a licensing agreement. They want to buy us. The whole company. All of it. The words hit Laura like a physical force, knocking the breath from her lungs. She stared at her reflection in the dark window, mouth open, phone pressed to her ear as if it were a lifeline to a reality that couldn't possibly be real. That's not... she began, then stopped. Maya, slow down. What exactly did they say? Okay. Maya took an audible breath, clearly trying to organize her thoughts. So you remember how they've been doing due diligence for the past month? All those financial reports and client testimonials and production capacity assessments? I thought it was just standard procedure for a potential partnership. Laura remembered. The endless spreadsheets, the detailed presentations, the seemingly invasive questions about every aspect of GreenNest's operations. She'd assumed it was thorough vetting for what might become a significant client relationship. Nothing more. Well, apparently it wasn't partnership vetting. It was acquisition research. Laura, they've been planning to make an offer for weeks. They wanted to wait until after Christmas to make it official, but then their board of directors met this afternoon and decided they couldn't risk waiting. Apparently there are rumors that 2 other major corporations are circling GreenNest, and they wanted to move first. Laura's reflection in the window looked like a stranger, pale, wide-eyed, uncomprehending. Other corporations? I know, right? When did we become so popular? But that's not even the best part. Maya's voice dropped to a whisper, as if she were sharing secret states. Laura, they want to pay $47 million. The number hung in the air between them like a mathematical impossibility. $47 million. She tried to process it.
to understand what those words meant in the context of her life, her small apartment, her thrift store dress hanging in the bedroom closet. "That's not," she said finally. "Maya, slow down. What exactly did they say?" Okay. So you remember how they've been doing due diligence for the past month? All those financial reports and client testimonials and production capacity assessments? I thought it was just standard procedure for a potential partnership. Laura remembered. The endless spreadsheets, the detailed presentations, the seemingly invasive questions about every aspect of GreenNest's operations. She'd assumed it was thorough vetting for what might become a significant client relationship, nothing more. Well, apparently it wasn't partnership vetting. It was acquisition research. Laura, they've been planning to make an offer for weeks. They wanted to wait until after Christmas to make it official, but then their board of directors met this afternoon and decided they couldn't risk waiting. Apparently, there are rumors that 2 other major corporations are circling GreenNest, and they wanted to move first. Laura's reflection in the window looked like a stranger, pale, wide-eyed, uncomprehending. Other corporations? I know, right? When did we become so popular? But that's not even the best part. Maya's voice dropped to a whisper, as if she were sharing secret states. Laura, they want to pay $47 million. The only thing you can really say about biodegradable packaging is that it makes people feel good about their waste. Laura, the world is changing. We changed it. And you didn't even say about the Youth Award? Laura stared at her reflection and half expected to see Daniel's mocking face there. But if she tried to figure out what Pinnacle Global Industries was doing, there was no doubt that she would still be here when they used to say the same thing that Daniel said about her Youth Award. It wasn't that Maya was wrong, but the way that Maya was talking was just too personal. And then suddenly, she remembered what he had said. I don't know, with a joke that one couldn't believe. She took the phone for herself. It wasn't that she didn't believe Maya, but she was scared that the phone was clutched in her hand.
Make them billions of dollars while saving the planet. They're buying us because we're brilliant and innovative and way, way ahead of the curve. Tears were streaming down Laura's face now, but they felt different from the tears she'd shed walking through the snow. These tears were relief and vindication, and joy is so pure it felt like light filling her chest. $47 million? She repeated, testing the words. 47.2, Maya corrected, and Laura could hear her friend's smile. Laura, we did it. We actually did it. We built something incredible, and the world is finally ready to see what we've been seeing all along. Laura thought about Daniel, probably asleep in his expensive apartment, dreaming of $700 million mergers and the satisfaction of being right about everything. She thought about her parents, tucked into their warm bed in the house where she'd grown up feeling like a perpetual disappointment. She thought about Aunt Clara's sharp laugh and Richard's careful neutrality and Sophia's gentle hand that had somehow felt like pity. Tomorrow, they would wake up to a world where Laura Martinez wasn't a dreamer chasing impossible visions. Tomorrow, she would be the founder of a company worth nearly $50 million, a visionary whose innovations were reshaping an entire industry. Maya, she said softly, what happens now? Now you get some sleep, because tomorrow we're going to celebrate Christmas, and then we're going to change everything. The contracts will be ready next week, but Laura, this is real. This is happening. We're about to become a very big deal. After Maya hung up, Laura sat in the quiet of her apartment, surrounded by the prototypes and patents and client letters that represented 3 years of her life. Everything looked exactly the same as it had an hour ago, but everything had changed. She was the same person who had walked through the snow feeling broken and dismissed, but she was also someone else entirely, someone whose work mattered, whose vision had value, whose dreams were worth $47.2 million. She picked up her phone and scrolled to her family's group chat, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. She could tell them now. She could share the news that would transform their perception of her overnight, could watch their shock and amazement and scrambling apologies. Instead, she set the phone aside and walked to her window, looking out at the snow-covered city that had become her home and her proving ground. Let them sleep in their certainty a little longer. Let them wake up tomorrow still believing that Daniel's way was the only way, that serious work only happened in glass towers and quarterly reports. Soon enough, they would understand that the woman they had dismissed as a dreamer was actually a visionary whose time had finally come. "I was always enough," Laura whispered to her reflection in the window. And for the first time in her life, she believed it completely. Laura couldn't sleep. She paced her small apartment like a caged animal, her bare feet silent on the hardwood floors, her mind racing between disbelief and euphoria. $47.2 million. The number felt surreal, like a lottery ticket that couldn't possibly be real until you held the check in your hands. She paused in front of her bookshelf, where a framed family photo sat among her collection of business journals and sustainability reports. The picture had been taken last Christmas, all of them gathered around Sophia's dining room table, smiling for the camera. Daniel stood behind their parents' chairs, his hands resting possessively on their shoulders, his smile confident and proprietary. Laura remembered how small she'd felt in that moment, relegated to the edge of the frame like an afterthought. Looking at the photo now, she could almost see the moment differently. Daniel's smile seemed less confident and more desperate, as if he needed constant validation of his importance. Her own smile, which had felt forced at the time, now looked mysteriously knowing, as if she'd been keeping a secret even from herself. What would his face look like when he found out? Daniel, who spent the evening explaining to her why her work didn't matter, who dismissed 3 years of innovation as playing at business. I could picture his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief to something that might actually resemble respect. The thought should have felt satisfying, but instead it left her strangely hollow. She set the photo down and walked to her desk where her laptop displayed the GreenNest logo against a black screen. With a few keystrokes, she could draft an email to her family, could attach the formal letter of intent that Maya would send tomorrow, could watch their shock unfold in real time through carefully worded responses and frantic phone calls. Her finger hovered over the power button. One email would change everything. Their perception of her, their understanding of her work, their regret over tonight's casual cruelties. She could have Daniel's apology by morning, her parents' admiration by noon, and Clara's grudging respect by dinner time. But something in her chest rebelled against the idea. This triumph was hers. This validation belonged to her, and Maya, and the small team who had believed in sustainable packaging when it was just a crazy dream sketched on coffee-stained napkins. Why should she rush to share it with people who had laughed at her just hours ago? Laura closed the laptop and walked to her window. Snow continued to fall, blanketing the city in pristine silence. Tomorrow is Christmas Day. Her family would wake up in the same
House where they dismissed her dreams, probably not even remembering the casual cruelty of their laughter. They would exchange gifts and share stories, and never once think about the woman who had walked out into the snow, carrying their judgment like stones in her pockets. Let them have their Christmas morning in ignorance. Let Daniel wake up satisfied that he'd put his little sister in her place, secure in his understanding of how the world worked. Let her parents continue believing that their successful son was the family's greatest achievement, while their dreamer daughter remained a gentle disappointment. The truth would emerge eventually. Business news traveled fast, and a $47 million acquisition wouldn't stay quiet for long. But Laura wanted to savor these precious hours when the victory was entirely hers, when no one could diminish it with surprise or attempt to claim credit for her success. She thought about Maya's voice, bright with excitement and fierce pride in what they'd built together. That was the kind of celebration Laura wanted. Honest joy from people who understood the magnitude of what they'd accomplished, who had believed in the vision even when it seemed impossible. Her family's eventual amazement would feel hollow by comparison, tainted by the memory of tonight's laughter. But this moment, this private triumph in the quiet of her apartment, belonged entirely to her. Christmas morning arrived, crisp and clear, the snow having stopped sometime before dawn. Laura woke feeling more rested than she had in months, despite having slept only 4 hours. The weight of validation sat differently than she'd expected, not as a burden of proof, but as a quiet confidence that seemed to radiate from her very bones. Maya had texted at sunrise, "Legal team meeting at 10. Bring tissues. I'm definitely going to cry again." Laura smiled as she dressed, choosing her favorite jeans and the GreenNest hoodie that Maya had designed for their second anniversary. No power suits or calculated impressions today. This was about the work itself, the pure joy of seeing their shared vision recognized and valued. The law office buzzed with barely contained excitement. Maya bounced in her chair, clutching a stack of documents like they were precious artifacts. The legal team, 3 sharp-suited professionals who usually maintained careful neutrality, couldn't hide their amazement at the terms Pinnacle Global had offered. "In 20 years of acquisition law, I've never seen numbers like this for a company of your size," admitted Sarah Chen, the lead attorney. "Your intellectual property portfolio is extraordinary. The patents alone are worth half the purchase price." Laura felt a flush of pride that had nothing to do with money. The patents represented late nights in her kitchen, failed experiments that taught her what didn't work, breakthrough moments when a new formula finally performed exactly as she'd envisioned. "And you're certain about the creative control clause?" Laura asked for the 3rd time. "Completely certain," Sarah confirmed. "You'll have final say over all product development with your own research budget and team. They're not buying GreenNest to change it. They're buying it because they want exactly what you've already created." Maya grabbed Laura's hands across the conference table, tears streaming down her face. "We did it," she whispered. "We actually did it." Laura squeezed back, feeling her own eyes fill. But these tears were different from the ones she'd shed walking through the snow. These were tears of pure accomplishment, of dreams made manifest, of work that had found its rightful place in the world. The contracts would be finalized after New Year's, but the reality of it settled around Laura like a perfectly tailored coat. She wasn't just Laura Martinez anymore, the family dreamer who chased impossible visions. She was Laura Martinez, CEO and Chief Innovation Officer of a revolutionary company that major corporations were willing to pay $47 million to acquire. "What happens next?" she asked, though for the first time in years, she wasn't worried about the answer. Boxing Day brunch at the Martinez house felt like stepping into an alternate universe where everything looked the same, but the fundamental physics had shifted. Laura walked through the front door carrying the same confidence that had carried her through yesterday's legal meeting and immediately sensed that something in the family dynamic had changed. It wasn't anything obvious. The same decorations, the same food, the same seating arrangements around Sophia's dining room table. But Laura carried herself differently, and differences like that radiated outward in ways that couldn't be hidden. "Laura, you look well-rested," Sophia observed, studying her daughter with the sharp eyes of someone who had spent 34 years reading her moods. "Much better than when you left last night." "I slept well," Laura replied simply, accepting a cup of coffee with genuine gratitude. It was true, she had slept well, despite the brevity. Success, apparently, was an excellent sleeping aid.
Listened politely, nodded at appropriate moments, but felt no need to compete or defend her own accomplishments. His stories were just stories now, not weapons designed to diminish her. "Laura's been awfully quiet," Aunt Clara observed with the calculating tone of someone poking at a potential source of drama. "Having second thoughts about that little business of yours?" "No second thoughts," Laura said mildly, her smile serene. "Just enjoying the holiday." Marcus, who had said little during last night's dinner, seemed to sense the shift most clearly. "How is GreenNest doing, Laura?
I've been reading about increased corporate interest in sustainable packaging solutions. The question was genuine, respectful in a way that stood out sharply against the previous night's dismissive mockery. Laura felt a warm gratitude toward this quiet family friend who had always treated her work with dignity. "It's doing very well," she replied, meeting his eyes with steady confidence. "We're seeing significant growth in both client interest and industry recognition." Daniel glanced up from his Eggs Benedict, perhaps detecting something different in his sister's tone. "How is GreenNest doing, Laura?" "Define significant," he said, the automatic challenge slipping out before he could stop it. But Laura just smiled, unruffled by the familiar provocation. "Significant enough," she said quietly, taking a sip of her coffee. The non-answer hung in the air, somehow more powerful than any detailed explanation would have been. Daniel frowned slightly, as if sensing that his usual dynamic with Laura had shifted, but unable to identify exactly how. Sophia continued watching her daughter with growing curiosity. The maternal radar that had guided her through decades of child-rearing, now detecting changes she couldn't quite name. Laura seemed centered in a way she hadn't been in years, grounded by something that went deeper than temporary confidence. "Well," Richard said into the growing silence, "it sounds like you're finding your footing." "I've already found it," Laura corrected gently, and the quiet certainty in her voice made everyone at the table pause. She didn't need to announce her triumph or justify her choices or defend her dreams. The truth would emerge in its own time and its own way. For now, it was enough to sit at her family's table knowing exactly who she was and what she'd accomplished, regardless of whether they understood it yet. The secret glowed quietly inside her, not demanding recognition, but simply existing, as solid and real as the coffee cup in her hands. Soon enough, they would all understand. But this moment of quiet vindication, this perfect knowledge of her own worth, belonged entirely to her. The news broke on a Tuesday morning in mid-January, splashed across the business section of the Chicago Tribune with the kind of bold headline that made commuters pause with their coffee cups halfway to their lips. Local startup GreenNest acquired for $47.2 million in landmark sustainability deal. Laura was in her office, soon to be her former office, when Maya burst through the door brandishing her tablet like a victory flag. "We're everywhere!" Maya shrieked, her voice cracking with excitement. "Bloomberg, Forbes, Wall Street Journal, LinkedIn. Laura, we're trending on 3 different business news sites." Laura looked up from the transition documents she'd been reviewing, her smile calm but radiant. 3 weeks had passed since that Christmas Eve phone call. 3 weeks of lawyers and contracts and careful negotiations. 3 weeks of carrying her secret like a warm stone in her chest, watching her family continue their familiar patterns while knowing everything was about to change. "The Forbes article is incredible," Maya continued, scrolling rapidly through her screen. "They called you a visionary entrepreneur who recognized the future of packaging technology before the industry giants caught up. And listen to this quote from the Pinnacle CEO. GreenNest represents the kind of innovative thinking that will define sustainable business practices for the next decade." Laura's phone had been buzzing steadily for the past hour, reporters requesting interviews, industry colleagues offering congratulations, former clients expressing amazement. But the call she was waiting for came at exactly 11:23 a.m., Sophia's name flashing on the screen with the urgency of breaking news. "Laura?" Her mother's voice was breathless, shaking with emotion. "Mija, is this real? The newspaper, the internet? They're saying your company sold for $47 million? "It's real, Mama." Laura kept her voice gentle, understanding the magnitude of what her family was processing. Sophia's sob came through the phone like a physical embrace.
I'm so proud of you. I'm so sorry we didn't. I should have. Oh, Laura, I'm so proud. The apology her mother couldn't quite articulate hung between them. Years of gentle dismissal and worried sighs suddenly recontextualized as profound misunderstanding. Laura felt her throat tighten with forgiveness she hadn't known she needed to give. I know, Mama. It's okay.
Her father called 30 minutes later, his architect's precision evident even in his emotional state. I owe you an apology, Laura. A significant apology. We were wrong about your work, about your vision. You proved us all wrong, and I couldn't be more proud to be proven wrong. Richard Martinez wasn't a man who admitted error easily, and the weight of his acknowledgement settled over Laura like a benediction she'd waited her entire life to receive. Daniel's response came via text message at 2:47 p.m., notable for both its brevity and its absence of his usual confident rhetoric. Congratulations, I was wrong about your business. No excuses, no attempts to minimize what had happened, no effort to claim any reflected glory. Just acknowledgement, finally, that the work he'd dismissed as a joke had been more serious than anything he'd ever accomplished. The text felt like closure, not just for Christmas Eve's humiliation, but for decades of casual condescension. By evening, Laura stood in her apartment surrounded by celebration. Maya had arrived with champagne and the entire GreenNest team, their small space filled with laughter and tears and the kind of joy that comes from watching impossible dreams become front-page news. "Speech!" someone called out, and suddenly everyone was looking at Laura expectantly, glasses raised in anticipation. Laura took a breath, looking around at the faces of people who had believed in her vision when it existed only in sketches and prototypes. These were her real family, the ones who had seen her worth before the world confirmed it. 3 years ago, she began, her voice steady and clear. I had an idea that most people thought was impossible, not because the technology was complicated, but because they couldn't imagine a world where environmental responsibility and business success weren't mutually exclusive. She paused, thinking of Daniel's laughter, of Aunt Clara's dismissive chuckles, of her parents' worried silences. But we knew better. We knew that the future belonged to companies brave enough to do things differently, smart enough to see opportunity where others saw obstacles, and persistent enough to keep building even when the world told us we were wasting our time. Maya wiped tears from her cheeks, raising her glass higher. So this celebration isn't just about money, though I won't pretend the money doesn't feel good. Gentle laughter rippled through the group. This is about vindication. This is about proving that dreams backed by hard work and intelligent execution aren't dreams at all. They're plans that haven't been recognized yet. As her team toasted and embraced and began planning their bright future, Laura walked to her window and looked out at the Chicago skyline. The city sparkled in the winter night, full of other dreamers working late in small other offices, believing in visions that might seem impossible to everyone else. Somewhere out there, her family was probably still processing the magnitude of what had happened, still adjusting their understanding of who she was and what she'd accomplished. Tomorrow, there would be more phone calls, more apologies, more attempts to bridge the gap between their perception and her reality. But tonight, Laura Martinez, founder, CEO, and now Chief Innovation Officer of a company worth $47.2 million, stood in her own space, surrounded by her own people, secure in the knowledge that had sustained her through every doubt and dismissal. I was always enough, she whispered to her reflection in the window, and the words felt like coming home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.